three things in the speech. Firstly, I'm going to give you 4 points of setup. Then I'm going to talk about how this generally improves conflict resolution processes. And then lastly, if I have any time at all left, I'm going to talk a tiny bit of how this data collection is going to be really useful for the government. 4 points in setup. First thing to say here is we think that this only would occur or only would intervene in cases mainly that enter formal arbitration, which is to say that if for example, an employee is seeking an apology from another employee, is just seeking them to have a small talking to about their behavior, these are things that can probably still be dealt with internally and is largely a case of intervening where it enters a serious actual arbitration process. This does not qualify as entering a formal arbitration process under that side. But the other thing we would note here is simply that the way that it works now is that there is an extended process that would occur of kind of mediation and talking within the internal HR process, where after that you would escalate. We would also potentially do things like allow companies to request that there be mediators present in those initial stages so that you can have better conflict resolution between the parties. We are happy to do those things as well. We would note also that this role is somewhat analogized to the extent of what the Ombudsman does now. We would just say that those are relatively analogous positions in their floating qualifications. Second thing, in terms of who we would hire to be as part of this body, we would note that we'd hire people that are specifically trained in arbitration processes. That might look like lawyers, it might look like people that are specifically trained mediators, and it especially might look like people that are specified to be trained to mediate in a certain industry, to be familiar with those processes, as well as any staff, I guess, to aid in those particular processes. Third thing we would note in setup is simply we would retain the ability to appeal to an ombudsman. These are not final decisions that are executed. We would simply just allow people to go through a further process and to, I guess, repeal or attempt to get some, I guess, other justice outside of those decisions. Fourthly, we would just note that we would have pretty strict budget and appointments restrictions, somewhat analogous to how you would appoint courts now. Okay, firstly on improving conflict resolution. 4 major problems with conflict resolution systems now in internal HR departments. First thing to note is that HR departments have strong incentive to side with the company or preference, or have specific deals that preference the company that come out of HR resolution processes. Note the reason that this is simply true is just that they determine their pay and bonuses, and also importantly that the evaluation of their performance by the company itself is based on how they help the company, it is based on the aid that they give to the functioning of the company overall, not necessarily their fairness or effectiveness of arbitration. Second thing we would note is simply there is a lot of conflicts of interest in the current system. That is because these are people that are working in the same workplace as the people that they're arbitrating. They're drinking the same coffee, they're talking at the lunch table every day. Obviously, you form a significant amount of personal connections with these people. It is harder to be fair and rational. And currently, we require them to recuse where they have no real incentive to do so, simply because they want to do things like preference their friends. We will note that the only intervening mechanism for this, which they might point to, is that the company might do so. But the reason the company does not care is simply because they care that the arbitration process ends quickly and it ends effectively, which to them looks like a benefit to the overall productivity. It does not look like a benefit to either worker. It does not look like the process being judged as fair. It looks like a quick resolution that means that they can get back to work. Third thing to note is that HR departments are often far too small, which is simply, firstly, in the case of small businesses, it is often not a precedent cost because you firstly want to reinvest in business infrastructure to grow your business before you do things like ensure you have proper HR procedures, because that is viewed as more important to you when you are growing your business. We would also note, secondly, that these are often viewed as more family businesses, so they view themselves as a closer, tight-knit group, as a more welcoming environment than they actually are, simply because they have less workers, because they view themselves as a close-knit community, despite the fact that these problems do actually happen. But this simply means they don't fund HR or don't seek it out to the same extent, and that is a major problem. Last thing we would note is in larger companies as well, often people just simply don't care about funding HR, which is to say that it's very hard to quantify the value that an HR department gives to the company. So when you're doing things like allocating a portion of your budget to an HR department, obviously it is hard to justify to investors why you are allocating like $10 million to HR arbitration. They don't really know what the fuck that means. That is going to be particularly difficult for them to justify. That is why it is likely to be underfunded. Fourth thing we would note is just simply the fact that people are aware of those first 3 mechanisms, and also a fourth one that I'll provide later. My structure's a bit bad here, is simply that means that they don't come forward in the first place. And that is one of the major problems. Because when you are aware that there's problems within your HR department, when you're unwilling to go because you know the HR rep that might be representing you is someone that is actually friends with the person you're having a dispute with, you're never likely to go forward in the first place. That was an unjust outcome for you. But also, lastly, we would note that in particularly demanding workplace cultures, HR departments that are embedded in those cultures are less likely to evaluate resolutions in the same way. Which is to say, for example, if you work as an HR department in a law firm or in a particularly particularly like large bank, then you're likely to assume something like overworking or particularly stressful environments are just part of the job, are just something that you should consider as normal, and therefore you are less likely to consider it fairly, you're less likely to consider each employee's preferences necessarily in a way that they should be, and those are a number of problems that we fix. Let's be incredibly comparative on how we fix each of these. Firstly, on siding with the company, obviously we would note here that the government body is simply independent. They are removed from the workplace culture. They have literally zero incentive to help those companies themselves. They don't care about company productivity, they care about the fairness of the worker. Second thing in conflict of interests is simply, firstly, obviously there is significantly lower chance of forming personal connections with anyone that you're arbitrating with. Obviously, because at the scale at which you're arbitrating in every business in Australia, if you are an individual person, you probably aren't friends with all of them. There's probably very little chance that you have that connection. But much more importantly, we're able to enforce it in a way that companies are not, simply because we're able to do things at this scale of like keeping previous working records or having declared conflicts on records for every worker and simply checking those at the point where any arbitration conflict comes in, which means you're able to do something like just quickly flag that a certain agent shouldn't be assigned to a certain case. You can instantly resolve that if you're at the scale of a national body. The third thing we would note is simply that the government has an incentive against this, which is simply to say that as a government body, they rely on a reputation of impartiality where a corporation doesn't. Because for people to actually come forward to them, they need to view them as impartial. They need to view them as friendly to them. They need to view them as someone that will support them. That was something that was uniquely important. That meant that the government would actually have a good incentive to refuse those conflicts of interest, and that it would be viewed as someone that they could trust and come forward to. Third thing in funding, obviously we aggregate all of all corporations would necessarily be reporting to this HR department, which means that we would just average out the over and underfunded departments. We could fix that problem and sort of separate it more equally, but also we would just know that we're able to access economies of scale because it's larger. I am actually going to explain what economies of scale means in this case, in this individual circumstance like this. Firstly, simply we're able to do things like concentrate skill and training in smaller sets of agents, which means that we're just able to invest more in a group of heavily qualified people and assign those people to each individual cases rather than having over and underqualified people. Secondly, we would note that we're able to have industry-specific specialists, which is just to say that we're able to have people that are especially trained in doing something like resolving a dispute in an industrial workplace. That is particularly valuable, but also thirdly, most importantly, we fix that problem of particularly demanding workplace cultures affecting resolutions because it is standardized training across all of these individuals, which is just to say that they are not centralized within that workplace environment. They are able to step outside it, and they are able to have a similar level of training or a similar level of stress of what is and isn't a fair workplace arbitration within their training itself. What are the impacts of this? Firstly, it obviously just leads to more fair resolutions, which is simply that each individual worker is just better off, they are more likely to trust this process because they will get better outcomes from it. That is a very simple impact. Secondly, obviously, it is way more time efficient. It's just simply because you're able to do things like address more disputes. That is obviously a benefit to all workers across the country, but also otherwise, whereas otherwise HR departments can still be overworked and underfunded, they have difficulties being able to address all complaints. This is just a much more effective system. But thirdly, note that employers now have a much larger incentive to actually improve workplace cultures at the outset because there is actual consequences to a negative HR decision. Because if they are found to have a pattern of abuse of workers, that is something which is particularly harmful to their reputation. That gets them going through me. For those reasons, very proud of them.
I'd like to thank the first affirming speaker for that fine speech, and I'd like to welcome up the first negative speaker to open up negative bench. Hear, hear.
I wouldn't blame you for being confused about what the affirmative team supports at the end of that speech, because this is a team which is affirming the motion that all workplace conflict resolution matters should be arbitrated by a national body, and in spite of that, supports keeping private HR firms and departments which exist under the status quo, keeping the Ombudsman and Fair Work Commission having oversight of the decisions that their body makes, and keeping the appeals process which already exists at the moment for decisions made by both internal HR departments and external regulators where those decisions are made, for instance, NCAT or the AAP. This team is just adding a federal body which engages in formal arbitration, which requires a fact-finding stage, which requires adversarial deposition and cross-examination, and binding decisions plus an appeal while not supporting their burden. The problem with that for this team is they're not functionally changing the way that most of these arbitrations happen. They just create an additional regulatory bottleneck, which we will explain is bad at fulfilling the purpose they say it should, is additionally expensive and therefore ineffective. What do we support? We largely support the status quo, where private HR departments and firms are mandatory for companies above a certain size. This team says, oh, well, that department often gets underfunded, which is something that's already illegal. That you need to have a functional HR department as a requirement as a company over a certain size. We'd be happy to beef up those regulations if necessary. Secondly, we point out major issues already get taken outside of the firm, which is why all of their analysis about how major disputes have people being biased, having conflicts of interest, falls out of the debate. Because where those things are serious, they already go to the Fair Work Commission, they already go to the Ombudsman, they already go to any other set of regulators, which explains to you why most of the analysis there doesn't make sense. And instead of acquiring and merging all HR bodies or all HR firms and departments at the moment, which is what this team is required to support by the motion, we would instead just support the bodies which exist at the moment, which are responsible for handling specifically those important decisions. That is, private HR at the moment handles all the squabbles. This team needs to make that responsibility federal. We say the change should be instead, just make the existing federal bodies or government regulators better at making the decisions which are hard. The second piece of setup I want to offer is an explanation about why people are often effective at managing the different channels they have for resolving conflict at the moment, which it kind of preempts any analysis these guys have, which is like, well, since the big decisions are so important, we should make the smaller decisions worse by making them federal in order to protect the really important ones. Here's why that's unnecessary. The first thing we'd point out is the vast majority of workplace disputes are minor. Think how many times, for instance, there are communication issues or people encroaching on each other's space or a workplace safety issue compared to the number of large-scale strikes, pay disputes on the number of hours worked, something like that. That explains to you why the first port of call for most workers is correct in the majority of circumstances, which is why the burden is actually very low for us to prove that people can figure out the handful of times where something is more serious and therefore escalate it to a public regulator. Secondly, though, we point out that major issues like pay disputes, hours disputes, or irreconcilable differences between colleagues tend to have people represented by bodies which understand the correct channels for them to pursue and understand the formality requirements required to do so. For instance, your union, for instance, literally your HR department, who will hand off issues where they are too serious. So it's unnecessary, even if this team runs that argument, that we need to make all decisions federal in order to protect some, for that to occur. Just us supporting the regulator would likely be sufficient. What are the harms then of making the system that they describe? The first is that the government is very bad at handling the vast majority of HR decisions, particularly a federal body, right? In particular for the little stuff, but we would say kind of this applies to all of them. The first reason is the government doesn't have much specific information about either the workplace in which this is occurring, nor the people involved in that dispute. Compare that to, for instance, HR or an ombudsman, at least in your industry, or an HR department's report getting passed on, which explains to you why typically the government needs to go through lengthy fact-finding processes, or acts with imprecise information, or needs to depose people in an adversarial way, expanding the cost of this, expanding the length of time in which these conflicts occur, or just making worse decisions. Secondly, we point out that the government cannot monitor the effects of those decisions as effectively as private HR, ombudsman, or the Fair Work Commission. For the reason that, for instance, a private HR firm or department exists within the company where they can easily make sure that changes or agreements have been made and are being adhered to. Whereas the government, via a federal body, we need to essentially put monitors within companies all over the country, or make sure that every decision is being followed up on and audited regularly, which explains an enormous efficiency loss, an enormous cost, which this team doesn't have the accounting to explain how they pay for it. But thirdly, we point out that also having your decisions negotiated or decided by bodies or people which are more proximate to you, so in our best case, private HR, but in our worst case, at least a body or an ombudsman within your industry or within your state, makes those decisions feel more organic, makes people feel like they're being understood more by someone who is specific to them and connects to them. And a federal body is just about the most alienating for a person who has a dispute. Just about the most stereotypical of a guy in a grey suit with a forgettable face, not listening to you or talking to you on the phone and then shutting you down. That is the problem with a model which pursues this aim, and it's why it doesn't work. But secondly, we'd also explain why even if a federal body is good, arbitration is a very bad way at handling workplace disputes for the majority of situations. Firstly, because arbitration carries a huge number of formality requirements, which makes them very long. Secondly, arbitration relies upon often not lawyers, but former judges, because arbitration is a trial that happens outside of a court, which is why you typically need a very small and elite handful of people to carry it out, which makes it expensive. Thirdly, arbitration is adversarial. People act as for and against opposing counsel. Fourthly, the decisions of arbitration is binding, which takes away a lot of flexibility from real human issues, which often require, changes as things go on. The impact of this is for trivial things, which are required to go through their body by the topic, the decision is just way worse. People don't feel understood, people don't feel heard, and those problems compound and mount as people don't feel happy or comfortable in their workplaces all over the country. But even for the major decisions, we've explained both a national body and arbitration are not the way to solve them. Second argument we'll explain is that the cost of the taxpayer is likely to be substantial. This is pretty simple, right? Formal arbitration, as I've explained, is expensive and hard to do. Plus, they have an appeals process through NCAT or the AAT. Secondly, there's a lack of cost control because the government is now spending not their money. This is a mandatory thing that companies have to pay for, whereas companies tend to be more judicious in the way that this cost is managed. And thirdly, fact-finding procedures tend to become necessary under their side of the house, which make things additionally worse. This argument probably can't win the debate on its own, but we point out if there's any doubt about the way that this team achieves any benefit, just increasing the cost is very ineffective. We would, for instance, be able to put that money to instead bolstering unemployment or bolstering regulators, stuff that is clearly more valuable. Finally, just some stuff on management being good at handling HR, which cuts away the main harm these guys have. 4 things. Firstly, we'd point out that generally companies need to be good at handling HR to attract talent, and given the competition for talent which exists at the moment, and the very tight labour market which exists at the moment, and it seems like it's going to get even worse as the population ages, they need to have good HR to have workers. Secondly, a kind of workforce which has been regulated effectively by HR tends to be more happy and more productive. This is like management 101 and something that most companies abide by. Thirdly, we point out that you want to avoid lawsuits or regulatory costs where these things go wrong. And although this team gives you some reason to think those things don't happen all the time, we point out that even them happening a couple of times is very expensive for the company because those regulatory investigations or lawsuits tend to cover a historical period of abuse or a historical period of wrongdoing, which is why not every instance needs to be reported or sued over, only a handful, and that's enough to frighten companies into doing the right thing. Whether you care about HR or not, this side just makes things worse than the status quo. They don't improve the regulatory process, they just add another layer. For those reasons, proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the first negative for that fine speech, and I'd like to welcome up the second affirmative speaker to continue the affirmative team's case. Here. Yep.
Let's start by just working through this team's list of objections before actually extending on the material Felix provides that receives very little response. Firstly, they say that we want to keep private HR firms around, which might not be fulfilling our burden. Very simple observation I'll make here is that private HR departments do more than just conflict resolution. They're often involved in setting the culture of the workplace, as Felix identifies. They're often involved in hosting events, managing recruitment, for instance. All of these are reasons why there probably is a department that would still exist. The key difference with our model, though, is as slide negative identifies, most workplace conflicts would go through an alternative process because we don't want to expose those conflicts to the sorts of issues we described to you in Felix's speech. They say that under the status quo, serious matters already go to regulators. But we'll identify that that often only happens after it's been processed through HR, which they themselves agree with. That is to say, if I'm facing a harassment case at work, if I go straight to the regulator, the first piece of advice they're going to tell me will be to raise it with my HR department under the status quo. And we think that's incredibly alienating for all of the reasons that Felix describes. They say that our body, which focuses on arbitration, perhaps does not necessarily fulfill our burden. But I'll identify firstly, even if you believe their side on the definitional scope in this debate, Felix's arguments apply universally to all disputes that are engaged in the context of this debate. And secondly, if you believe that serious issues under the status quo will already go to places like Fair Work, where you believe this debate should be about an alternate body that supplants the purpose of HR, we would have that body continue to be accountable to existing accountability structures. We'll just replace those functions as we explained to you in Felix's speech. Given that, let's look through this team's reasons to suggest why this body might be particularly bad. They provide a few reasons. The first is to claim that this might be made substantially more inefficient, and they give reasons like, for example, explaining that workplace disputes might be relatively minor in the vast majority of instances. That's why we would support an existence of, perhaps a norm or some other standard that suggests that things like, for instance, basic sorts of complaints and issues that otherwise could just be resolved by a conversation would be, in most cases, managed internally. But even if you do not believe that is a requirement, that is defensible by our side, we're willing to accept those sorts of issues going to that external firm for the reason that they're able to provide a more consistent ruling, that they're able to do things like actually avoid the conflict of interest issues we explained to you under our side of the house. And note that this team complains that such a government body might be perceived to be a grey suit or might be perceived to be unempathetic. But for the reasons we explained to you, often people feel great amounts of personal risk when entering into HR relationships with people who they work closely with or with people who they know. Those are individuals who, as negative team identifies, are related in the industry and can affect future employment prospects, for instance. Or, for instance, people who you might have a close personal relationship with, where a conflict of interest is difficult to declare because your HR department might be too small, or you might work for a sufficiently small business that is not subject to the requirements this team wants to talk about. Those are all reasons why we expose a far better HR service to a substantially larger amount of workers. This team observes that under the status quo, the private HR firm will do squabbles and that ombudsmen will do serious stuff. We explained to you already that HR departments also often have to process much of that serious stuff before at the point at which a dispute occurs between HR and the individual. That is the point at which it escalates. And the reason for this should be relatively simple, right? Oftentimes, the workplace regulator regulates private HR under the status quo for the reason they identify, which is that many of the powers divested in creating that safe workplace are offloaded to HR. Which means the role of a regulator under the status quo is to make sure the HR department is not doing anything wrong. But in cases where a private squabble is occurring between two workers, there often is no recourse, even in cases where that HR department has made an unfavorable ruling towards one individual or another. What this all means then is that under their side of the house, people are much less willing to go to HR because of the fact that they see it as somebody they work closely with, which they never respond to. People have far less faith in the ability of HR departments to make fair and just rulings, and that is something which is sufficiently ameliorated under our side. They give a few reasons for why HR departments then might potentially be good. They say that oftentimes HR departments internally have an incentive to regulate to prevent things like efficiency loss in business, for instance. They say that oftentimes having an internal HR department can make those decisions feel more organic. But we explained to you already why that's necessarily a bad thing. Because oftentimes when people go to HR, the issue they have is actually frequently quite textbook. There are a lot of regulations on the correct way to be treated in the workplace. What that means is that insofar as you have a case which you believe is pretty specifically within the letter of the law, you often would prefer an individual to directly process that rather than taking into account those subjective factors within the internal workplace. It's a better way of protecting your direct and explicit rights that you're enshrined to. They say that oftentimes arbitration is particularly bad and formalized for dealing with many of these issues. We'll suggest that, firstly, this seems to contradict many of their previous complaints about our model, where they explain that, well, we need to process most of the smaller scale minor issues as well in the first instance. But secondly, even if you believe that we need to send all of the processes through our body, we would suggest that that is probably also a good thing, insofar as even if you have to deal with those minor issues, we can at least do it in a consistent and more fair way. They finally say that HR departments have an incentive to self-select for the best set of individuals to ensure a healthy corporate culture. But the problem with this argument is that that's exactly what they focus on. They only focus on the corporate culture of a location. They focus on the economic benefits and outputs of that HR department. And as Felix explains to you, that's often quite separate from what is actually best in issues of conflict resolution, which are specifically things which are relatively one-off in the way that they occur, do not affect the day-to-day workings of all the employees, even if they are substantial to some, which means that what HR department recruiting actually does is select for the set of individuals who perhaps can improve culture, who are able to do things like work in those functions, which is why we're willing to accept that, but are not particularly suited towards things like conflict resolution and have strong incentives where those conflicts occur to resolve them quickly in a way which keeps them out of mind for the vast majority of the employees. That explains why those external HR departments are actually quite bad at maintaining the sort of conflict resolution prospects and why we would prefer our model. They say that HR departments have an incentive to be really good at moderating internal disputes, to do things like avoiding lawsuits and regulators. We'll point out a few things. Firstly, under the status quo, many regulators are already overburdened, which is a reason to suggest why many HR departments under the status quo do often get away, especially in small businesses, with acting perversely, because it is difficult to engage with that sort of practice. We explain that insofar as you consolidate those resources, you grant individuals training, and you're more able to easily engage in filtering processes that efficiently allocate agents to different cases. That's the point at which you open up access to HR services in a way which is far better for the average worker, because that's the case in which you are actually meaningfully able to maintain a sort of strict compliance. But additionally, we'll point out that even if there is an incentive to avoid things like lawsuits, etc., all of that means that those corporations need to engage in having a sufficient amount of conflict resolution to prevent the system from regulating them. All right, given all of that, why do we think then that this is a policy which is something that should be encouraged? We think that it clearly avoids the worst harms of HR that prevent individuals from accessing at all, and that form of conflict resolution is going to be better than none.
I'd like to thank Second Affirmative for that fine speech. Before I welcome up Second Negative, I just want to make a note not to make comments during speakers' speeches. Without further ado, then, I'd like to welcome up Second Negative to continue the debate. Here.
The first thing I'll do is clarify the burden of the affirmative team in this debate. The first thing they say in that previous speech is that HR would still exist. It does things other than conflict. That's fine. The difference in this debate is that they are removing the conflict resolution function of HR, and outsourcing it. It's fine that HR exists for some other reason. The main thing that HR does in the status quo is conflict resolution. So you would just be functionally transforming it into a different body with the same name. That's fine, but it's not relevant to the debate. The second thing they say is, well, HR would still do some small conflict resolution. One, this is not a plain English reading of the motion which specifies all conflict resolution in the workplace. You should believe that is everything, even trivial things. But secondly, if that is true, they concede basically all of their benefits, and they make things worse, because if you believe their characterization of HR departments as evil and self-interested, that means they're going to pressure you to use the internal mechanisms of HR rather than go to their supposedly better nationalized body. And thirdly, that is extra bad because you're spending additional money, additional layers of bureaucracy that you don't need if you're dealing with both systems as they support on their side, as opposed to just the one on ours, especially if you're dealing with appeals to those internal decisions in the nationalized body. They try to escape their burden, all they do is tangle their feet. First substantive issue then is why this is simply enormously expensive. Daniel details a range of reasons why it will be, but get no response to them, so all I'll do is impact. Why does it matter that this is a hugely costly policy? The first thing to note in terms of weighing is the affirmative places an unjust burden on every taxpayer, not merely on the ones who happen to use their nationalised body. So in terms of the scale of people this affects, we are coming up ahead. But secondly, even if you believe the most charitable reading of the affirmative team's case, ask yourself, would the average worker prefer slightly improved conflict resolution at the cost of worse infrastructure and higher taxes? I do not think that is the case. Most people care far more about the certain benefit of economic value that we provide. But thirdly, the counterfeit that we'll use, because they're using all their money creating this enormously expensive policy, gives us a very concrete benefit, which is things like spending more money on unemployment benefits. Even if that increase in unemployment benefits is very small, it's certainly concrete, it accrues to people, it makes productivity better, it makes people's lives better. Compare that to the enormously speculative benefit they're providing by propping up this new body. So we win the debate, I think, already on the fact that they are just doing a very expensive policy and they have had quite a lot of difficulty proving a benefit. The second thing I'll do then is deal with their attacks on HR. They make, I think, broadly 4 claims. The first is that HR is required to side with the company, and that is true in some general sense, but they do very little to prove that companies have incentives that are misaligned with workers. We explain, number one, that they have a strong incentive to attract talent or attract people, and I'm going to add a bit of analysis here about why this is true, even in, for instance, relatively low-skilled workers, so even in companies like, say, McDonald's or other fast food workers, these sorts of incentives still apply, and they still don't want to abuse them. The first thing I note is that even in low-skilled jobs, there are many options for workers to enter for the reason that those skills are so unspecific. So you can go to McDonald's, you can go to Hungry Jack's, you can go elsewhere, because those skills open up many companies for you because they're so unspecific. So that analysis about how those workers might be individually replaceable, in fact, cuts both ways, particularly in the context of a relatively tight labour market, and indicates that the differentiator is the conditions of those companies rather than the company itself or the specific work they do. So if a company treats you poorly, that's exactly the reason you have to leave McDonald's for Hungry Jack's, because the work there is quite similar. Secondly, those sorts of low-skilled companies are much more vulnerable to things like class action lawsuits, which are substantially more expensive for those companies. Thirdly, they're often closely watched and investigated, or the company's chosen to be investigated by commissions like the Fair Work Commission and so on, because there's a perception that abuses are going to be more likely in those companies. And fourthly, because they have very large workforces, there's a much higher chance of things like whistleblowers, and you only need one person to speak up about abuses within those companies in order for things to happen. And that's why it's very likely that HR and those management systems work well, even within companies where labour is relatively low skill. But the second thing is that companies want their workers to be productive. And the negative team says that's bad, it means you exploit them, it means you want them to go back to work immediately rather than rest up. But it's incredibly unclear why that is true. You would have to believe that companies in HR are incredibly short-sighted, that they want productivity for the next month rather than to retain that employee as productive for the next year. And of course they have the ability to make those long-term decisions, as companies do all the time, because they have access to data, because you're making it through a formalized management process and so on. Why is it the case that improvement to your workplace culture would equal less money? They never explain why that is the case, unless you're talking about, say, highly specialized workplaces, which are designed for good reason to be stressful. Things like, for instance, highly specialized finance workplaces. It's fine that people get a bit stressed there. They opt into it. They get compensated with huge pay packages. In other contexts in which workplace culture makes people stressed in a way that is unproductive, HR has every incentive to push back on that. And thirdly, we point to fear of lawsuits, which they insufficiently rebut. So that mechanism is out. We give far more analysis about why workplace incentives are aligned with workers. The second claim they make is that HR is too close to culture and people. That means there are conflicts of interest because there are personal relationships, and you see things like overworking as normal. The first thing I'd observed is that conflicts of interest are incredibly rare, because very rarely are you litigating conflicts between, for instance, the person who hires you as HR, like the CEO, and their underlings. Mostly it's underling v. underling, in which case you have absolutely no conflict of interest as HR at all. But secondly, I note that HR selects for people who are very nice. It trains them in tact and respect. So it's very unlikely that being close to people in your workplace means you're unable to deliver information well. It means the opposite, in fact. Thirdly, I know that it's a benefit because these HR professionals understand the dynamics of the workplace. They understand relationships between people, and they can, for instance, see through bullshit and frivolous complaints in a way that government bodies removed have a much more difficult time doing. Fourthly, it means that decisions are much more likely to be respected, even if you don't agree with them, when they're from a person you know, and indeed when they're from a person at all, as opposed to an abstract government body. And finally, I know that it's far easier for conflicting parties to advocate for themselves when they're talking face to face with a real person, as opposed to simply submitting a form and getting feedback from it weeks and weeks later. So that falls to us. Third reason they give is that HR is too small, they don't exist for small businesses. That is a bad argument for 3 reasons. 1, most businesses above a certain size have a strong legal requirement to have HR, and we're willing to use our canopy out to make sure that that is policed. Secondly, smaller businesses have less need for HR because they have fewer employees to have conflicts between. But thirdly, in those instances, you just use going to government like models like the Fair Work Commission or an ombudsman or your union or like a tribunal in the status quo anyway, so that simply is not part of the debate. Final claim they make is on economies of scale, but they don't give reasons why this is likely, and in fact, diseconomies of scale are far more likely, because 1, bureaucracy comes from having more of these formal processes, which means you waste time and money, and secondly, because the government doesn't understand workplace-specific needs and dynamics, that means you're likely to get more bad decisions and more appeals, which waste time, waste money. HR is very good, they do not give us nearly sufficient analysis to explain why it's not. Finally, then, let's deal with their defense of the government. The first thing I'd observe is that we co-opt their benefits in most of the most important cases. You can still go to the Fair Work Commission, you can still use your union, you can still go to the Ombudsman. And second affirmative, they say, well, when you go to government regulators, they just tell you to go to AR. That is obviously false, like the average reasonable voter knows that is true. They provide no analysis to explain why that is, and their own analysis suggests otherwise, which is that the government is awesome and HR is evil. Why would an awesome person tell you to go to an evil person if you believe their analysis? Clearly, government regulators want to have more clients, they want people talking to them, that is their job. The next thing they say is, well, government relies on consistency. Consistency is very frequently bad, when what you need to resolve complex, nuanced, interpersonal dynamic relationships and conflicts is an understanding of the particular relationships you're in, is flexibility about decisions. That is the benefit we claim. The claim about whether the government is good or not, the highest impact set of cases, is entirely captured by side negative. In most of workplace conflict, which often happens, which often is petty, which can be resolved by a real person, they just simply put an enormously expensive burden on the taxpayer, they waste people's time, and that's why we win.
I'd like to thank second negative for that fine speech. I would now like to welcome up third affirmative to conclude the substantive portion of affirmative's case. Here.
Firstly, I'll talk about the fairness and adequacy of dispute resolution, and then I'll talk about efficiency and cost. Firstly, on what side gets better dispute resolution. Firstly, I'll deal with their positive material here. I think their first claim here is like, well, the government is worse at doing dispute resolution because they don't have information. You have to do things like fact-finding and annoying. But I think we respond to this in 3 ways. Firstly, we point out oftentimes having information is a harm as opposed to a benefit, because the government having to do fact-finding is a benefit that we claim under our side, when HR departments under their side skip over fact-finding, presume that they know like the nuance of the scenario as they do, presume and impose their previous understandings of people's character because they've dealt with them in previous HR complaints, and do not realize the truth of the situation. So they see something as a minor dispute as opposed to actually a harassment case. Secondly, I would just say the government can do fact-finding and can do it far better than the HR departments can, because they don't make those bad presumptions that HR departments do. We tell you from the start that government's able to do things like specialize in specific industries or types of cases. And I would just note in this, like, there is a more limited level of fact-finding that is necessary than what the other team would say. Oftentimes, as it works in civil dispute resolution, parties will do it themselves, which is both parties will present like the facts that they believe to be true. Most of the time they will agree on it, and there are only 1 or 2 small things that the government has to find. And I would say in that case, if their impact is, well, now you have to do the fact-finding, that is particularly important, because we'd much rather have a neutral arbitrator determining the most relevant facts as opposed to a HR department who is playing with the stack deck like we have pointed out. I think their second claim, and perhaps their better one here, is, well, perhaps it's harder for the government to monitor, whether or not after you have resolved the dispute, whether or not any changes are actually made. I would just point out, firstly, the relevant thing is less capacity here, the relevant thing is less like the capacity or the closeness of the HR department versus the government to the company, because it's not true that often, for example, a HR department is able to do things like, see into interpersonal disputes or harassment cases, or the HR department is not on the construction site to see whether, for example, changes to work health safety have been made. So the relevant thing for monitoring HR disputes isn't whether it's like part of the company or part of the government, it's whether people feel comfortable reporting to you, which we explain is better under our side, when people feel like you have an objective and neutral arbitrator, as opposed to someone who is literally employed and on tender from your company, whose profit directly comes from that company. That is the scenario where people don't report, so the monitoring capabilities are worse on their side. At that point, we have flipped their two main claims about the capacity or the sort of quality of government regulators being poor, which means those things cannot stand as positive material. The rest of their analysis in terms of whether HR departments is sufficient is largely responsive and mitigatory. The first thing I'll do is go through their series of just sort of general responses or general cases, general reasons why HR departments may be sufficient. I think the strongest one that they give and the one that gets the most time at second name is, well, company incentives are to have HR departments be sufficient, so there isn't a problem in the first place, like you want to keep people happy and that sort of stuff. I think the first, or the zeroth response to this is just obviously this is empirical, not true. HR problems happen all the time, workplace accidents happen all the time because companies do not have proper procedure in place. People are overworked and are stressed all the time, so it's just true that their incentive hasn't happened in the real world and is simply fantasy. But the next thing I would point out to you, and secondly, it's just I think their incentive on this is far less direct than the incentive which we point to, which is to say, yes, perhaps it is true in the long run if, for example, you don't have proper workplace and health and safety, maybe construction workers will be less likely to work for you. But compare that to you can't finish the construction on budget or on time. That's the thing that actually directly affects your company, which explains why our impact, which is more concrete and more certain, is the more pertinent thing to the company's decision making when it is deciding what types of regulation to implement and enforce. But the second thing I would point you to here is just the often the incentive as it explained by them often doesn't exist, because often the reputation of companies is just relatively opaque. Perhaps it is true for repeat offenders like Goldman Sachs. People know they have a bad workplace culture, but the vast majority of the debate doesn't occur in a context like that. People don't know the reputation of individual construction companies or their level of adherence to regulations. Just because simply first of all, oftentimes it's a private dispute. Oftentimes people don't talk about things like their workplace industries because they're fear of reprisal from their bosses because it's something that is sensitive or important. So just their mechanism of the incentive to keep your workers happy doesn't necessarily apply. Their final point here is, well, you want to avoid lawsuits. I would say this is firstly just reasonably symmetric, to the extent there are a set of lawsuits you might want to avoid. Perhaps you take those ones. I don't think that's sufficient to overcome the series of instances where you do need a better sort of method of dispute resolution. Secondly, I think there are just lots of practical barriers to doing that. I think I've already explained the fact that this is a less direct incentive also applies as a response to this. I think that is their best response out of the way. I think the rest of their analysis here is mostly just smaller squibbles. They're oh, well, it's illegal to underfund HR departments and maybe we'll beef up regulation. I don't think they explain why you can't. The problem of regulation right now isn't that it's not beefed up enough. It's very hard to scrutinize, or it's just impossible to beef up these HR departments. We tell you from first, that oftentimes small businesses just can't afford to employ people into these HR departments. To the extent they want to mandate them, that's fine. The small business will just now cease to exist. They will lose money. That is a cost that we can avoid on the outside. I'll discuss this later when I talk about cost. They're oh, well, you can already take it to a public regulator if it's really extreme. I think we even preempted this in first affirmative when we explained that in the status quo, there's a norm against doing things like that because you're seen as a snitch. Inside your business, instead of taking it to your internal HR department under their side, if you go straight to the regulator, you seem like you're causing trouble. The HR department won't report it because that's them literally saying we can't do our job, and that is lost for income from them. That is also, again, reflecting badly on the company, who, as I've already pointed out, is the one who pays you. So we've turned that norm around on the outside when all HR disputes go to the regulator and improve that. So a lot of the worst instances don't get to the regulator on their side. Their final squibble is oh, well, lots of HR disputes are minor, so we don't need this. It's not a problem, and this also responds to that cost stuff. If it's minor, obviously the government will treat it in a minor way. We'll send one well-trained mediator out there to resolve the situation. But I would just say minor situations often do mask serious harassment cases. What may appear as simply a small dispute can often be very important. I think a lot of their sort of mitigation or sort of reasons why this is not necessary is empirically untrue and solved on the outside. Because we explain that HR departments or firms where HR are outsourced compete on the basis of providing profit to the companies that are employing them. That's the more important mechanism than HR people or nice. I think they can see that this conflict of interest exists at second negative when they're oh, well, it's between underling and underling as opposed to underling and the company, which explains in instances where you do have beef with the company, which is probably the majority of the cases because they're the ones who are not, for example, providing you proper workplace regulation. That conflict of interest exists. In that scenario, we'd rather have a well set up national regulator to deal with this. I think all of their other responses don't really get to the meat of our mechanisms. It's not about conflicts of interest that are explicit, but the fact you know the social dynamics. You might be friends, you work in the same office room, you get tea in the same lunchroom as the people you're mediating against. I've dealt with the stuff about culture and it's underfunded. I think we get a massive win on fairness. I think that is a trade-off that you ought to make regardless of what you think the cost is. I think you also ought not undercredit our impacts here, which is people go to HR under our side, so instances of abuse or neglect that we don't even know about under their side get dealt with, and now workplaces who know they can be held accountable fix their issues preemptively and more importantly. The last thing I want to deal with is their material about efficiency. I think I've actually defeated the mechanisms for this already when I explained fact-finding is not something that's that bad, or things like monitoring it is that bad. The only other sort of leg to stand on here is arbitration is really expensive. I point out the word arbitrated in the topic refers to the ordinary meaning, not the strict legal sense. The stuff you need judges or it must be binding isn't necessarily true. Obviously, we can do mediation and adjust the scale to the thing of it. But the final response is obviously our mechanism about the efficiency is more important because the cost on businesses is also a cost more so than anything about tax.
I would like to thank Third Affirmative for that fine speech, and I'd like to welcome up Third Negative to conclude the substantive portion of the negative bench and the debate as a whole. He's here. I'd like to thank Udai for that speech.
The most certain impact in this debate is that side Affirmative spends the money of everyday citizens. They waste it on a duplicative effort that does not provide any benefit. We give you 4 reasons as to why this would be expensive. Firstly, the fact that arbitration as a process is inherently expensive, and we think they do have to defend the process of arbitration as the topic suggests. Secondly, the fact that they provide an endless avenue of appeals, from private HR that they still wanted to defend for some reason, to the national arbitrator, then to the ombudsman, then to the Fair Work Commission, then to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, then to the court system after that. Thirdly, because as we explained, governments have a tendency to be bureaucratic, they have a tendency to lack cost control measures, they have a tendency to balloon their budgets. And finally, because they substantially duplicate the efforts of already existing bodies, which means just paying for things again and again. It's what Jack says when they defend a new fact-finding process occurring at every stage of the investigation, rather than just allowing the local HR team, who already knows what the facts are on the ground, to make a quick determination. It's what happens when you create a new body that's sandwiched between 5 existing layers of bureaucracy that already handle the same problem. And this mattered for 2 very important reasons in the debate. The first one was that it took money away from ordinary people. Firstly, in the form of taxes that were needed to fund this, but secondly, in the form of the opportunity cost. Things like we suggest all the way at First Negative, like increasing unemployment benefits, which mattered because that additional money was what gave people freedom and agency and leverage against companies. People who had stronger unemployment benefits were more free to quit a bad job and simply find a better employer, put competitive pressure on businesses to improve conditions to attract talent. But it also just meant that people felt more free, searching longer for a job that would give them the conditions they needed. That was the most effective way to give people better workplace conditions. Just give them more money. We did that. Secondly, though, it explains why regulators are less effective on their side than they are in the status quo. Because we have the money needed to beef up the existing regulators. So if you buy this team's contention that the problem at the moment is some regulators are underfunded, the solution seems intuitively the one that we suggest, which is use the money on beefing up those regulators, hire more people, allow for more investigations, rather than duplicating the efforts of those existing regulators, which we would note is bad for the reason that the very staff you would need to staff their regulator come from the existing regulators. Weaken the existing capacity for investigations, weaken the capacity to regulate the industry. Which means that this team starts the sum up of this debate in the hole. People have less money, regulators that already exist and do a good job are weaker, so their need to prove a benefit is very high and must be very substantial for them to get anywhere. Let's then examine the benefit that they attempt to prove. Because the crux of their case is to say that there are 4 ways in which private HR fails in the status quo, which their national body would be able to address, and that is the big benefit that they want to rest their laurels on. We defeat this in 2 ways. Firstly, we demonstrate that the incentives of existing HR bodies are good, and therefore the problems that they suggest just do not arise in the first place. Because if you look at the list of 4 problems that they identified, an HR body that actually cared about putting out good decisions just, wouldn't make unfair decisions, would have the conflict of interest policies necessary so that the person making determinations was not involved with the parties and was independent of the business and management. And many HR departments are structured that way. Would have the incentives to adequately read through the facts, would not just rush out decisions to get workers back to work. And we then provide you a strong set of reasons as to why it's likely that HR departments do have reasons and incentives to want to give fair and accurate decisions and not just poor decisions as this team suggests. That is, firstly, that companies, their claim is just that HR has the incentives of doing what management wants, therefore they won't do what is best. But we explain the interests of management are for HR to give the best possible decisions. Because only when HR gives fair and accurate decisions can you attract workers. Can you keep those workers happy? Can you keep those workers motivated? And only then are you able to avoid the lawsuits and government action that is devastating to a company. Being sued doesn't just mean the risk of jail time for the executives, doesn't just mean the risk of large financial penalties. It's hell for those executives individually. Their reputations are torn up. They spend time dealing with that lawsuit in courtrooms, looking guilty instead of being able to get on with the job that they wanted to do, which is why they're so desperate to avoid it. We additionally point out there are lots of employment lawyers, many of them work on contingency, and they're constantly searching around for companies that violate employment law in order to drum up business. We additionally extend this analysis at second negative, explaining why even in the most vulnerable context, even in even in cases of low-skill industries, it's very likely that workers' rights are protected. Because there are many employers in these industries, because conditions are often the key differentiator between employers. If you have a minimum wage job, the thing you care about is the conditions, because the pay kind of sucks. Thirdly, there's lots of information, because all your friends work at different companies and you can ask them about it. And there's an incredibly high risk on the companies for government investigation regulation, because these are the very companies that people suspect are likely to be engaging in violations of employment law. But secondly, because you have so many employees, all you need is one person to blow the whistle, and immediately the game is up. Which explains why you ought to believe HR regulators have the incentive to do what is right by employees, and if you believe that, all of the problems they identify wash out of the debate. Because if they have the correct incentives, it's very easy for them to implement the systems that will produce fair and accurate decisions. That takes their sole benefit out of the debate. But even if you believe none of that analysis, we defeat it in a second way. Just point out we don't just have to defend HR systems on their own, we defend the whole regulatory apparatus within which they exist in. Which is to say that if you're unhappy with what your HR has done, you can appeal to the Ombudsman, you can appeal to the Fair Work Commission. There already exists avenues of redress, and Dan provides analysis at the start of his speech explaining why people know those options exist, why they're able to navigate those options, and why they're likely to effectively engage with them. But secondly, the existence of those options creates pressure on HR departments to do a good job. Because when you have appeals coming up, it looks bad for your company. It risks investigations, it risks legal action, but secondly, because there's just legislative mandates about things that need to occur. For example, like individual companies need to have HR departments, unlike what this team would have you believe, which explains why many of those problems don't arise. The best possible response to this is just to say maybe some very small businesses lack the capacity to have HR. Like one, we point out that seems to also suggest that they're relatively small and unlikely to have very many disputes, because disputes tend to grow with the number of people interacting with each other. But secondly, even in those instances, we point out you could immediately go to the Fair Work Commission, you could immediately go to the Ombudsman. It's unclear what additional value this team is able to provide in those contexts. So at the end of all of this, it's really unclear what benefit this affirmative team is able to provide in the debate, but it's very clear the harms to their policy. Finally, we address the debate in a third way by explaining just why private HR is actually doing a better job and their body prevents it from doing so. Because we explained that you're likely to have better localized knowledge, specific information, that means that you're just able to make better decisions. They say maybe that means you're biased and you do it poorly, but we explain why the incentives are not to just have like a biased guy quickly rush out a decision, but instead to avoid things like expensive fact-finding processes and adversarial depositions that are harmful to the very people they seek to protect. We explain why it's much easier for local HR to monitor workplaces, to ensure policies are met, to ensure that people feel understood and heard, and explanations as to why arbitration is a process that is uncomfortable for people to engage in. The more flexible solutions that we are able to provide are the ones that ought to carry the day. For all of those reasons, at the end of this debate, private HR was best placed to handle 99% of the complaints. The remaining 1% went to regulatory apparatus, and that is why you should side with negative.
I'd like to thank the negative for that fine speech, and I'd like to welcome up Meg Reply, where, like the speaking scores, the time is halved and the bells are halved. Without further ado, Meg Reply.
Scores are halved?
Could be
So that's been really good.
Could be minus 40. It's the same thing, isn't it? For some of us.
First, on what this team says is different about their model, and then secondly, on what is actually different. Let's start with what this team says is different. I think their best claim in this debate is to say that where there's a conflict of interest between HR and one of the parties involved in a dispute, you'd want to take that decision external. But even on that seemingly intuitive and plausible argument, we give you the responses to think that existing HR firms or departments don't suffer from that problem very frequently. Firstly, we explain that the precise conflict that they describe, which is either the person who signs your paychecks or specifically your friend is involved in HR and involved in the conflict, are rare. Firstly, because of probability. Secondly, because HR firms tend to be more than one person. And thirdly, because often the person who signs your paycheck, that is the C-suite, isn't involved in conflicts with the rank and file. But beyond that, and I think in a way that kind of undercuts a lot of their arguments, we also explain that most of those problems can be taken external, to the Ombudsman, to regulators, and importantly, helped by people like unions, industry reps, and your peers. Their characterization of how government bodies are effective also explains to you why problems like snitching, problems like being referred back, being seen as a snitch, or problems like being referred back to HR don't occur once you have the protection of a government body, which rules out, I think, their best claim. But beyond that, I point out that we prove that just about everything else they say is different is actually symmetric. For small businesses, companies too small for HR already get external relief and receive support from the government to do so through regulators and tribunals. For economies of scale, it's unclear what exactly scales up. Like if you understand the two people involved in a dispute in one company, that doesn't mean you have any additional knowledge about the two people involved in a dispute in another company. For specialization, it's unclear how specialized you need to be. Understanding the laws and regulations which apply to an industry doesn't take a national body's expertise, but an undergraduate degree. For reporting, we explain that looking like a snitch happens as soon as you invoke anything. There's not a clear distinction between the cop being from the inside or from the outside, and that they say themselves there's a norm of using your own HR firm under their side, even though that HR firm's power has been gutted. And even if you don't buy all of that structural analysis we provide, our characterization of internal HR explains to you why the worst forms of abuse they provide are unlikely to occur. That takes this team out of the debate. What is actually different? We explain to you two harms of invoking that model. The first is you burn money, and I'll summarize exactly how we prove it. We say M&A is expensive, which they have to do to get the model off the ground. Arbitration is expensive, bureaucracy is expensive, appeals are expensive, and duplication is expensive. And I know that it's trendy, particularly amongst the youth of debating, to say money doesn't matter, we'll tax the rich until they're poor. But money does matter. And we've explained to you down the bench why the opportunity cost is important. Because it's our side which can investigate the serious cases of abuse where they occur, because our regulators have the airspace to do so. It's our side which can beef up unemployment benefits to give people the choice required to balance out power imbalances between employees and employers. It's our side which can buy political capital to do all of these things by lowering taxes because we don't have to spend money, kind of duplicating systems which already exist. We also explain what changes is compounding nuisances. Because, like we all know from our real experiences in the workplace, the most common conflicts between colleagues aren't serious ones, but minor ones. We explained that internal HR already has all the details, the context, and the ability to monitor decisions where they're made, which has important impacts. Because although the premise of this argument is that the initial issue is minor, they compound over time, and making better decisions and making people feel more comfortable by having someone who's at least recognizable to them, rather than a formal arbitration process be the decider of their fate, adds up across the thousands of major employers across the world, Australia, and millions across the world, and hundreds of cases which get reported to each of those firms each year. Workers under our side are adequately protected, but they're more comfortable and richer. That's why we win the debate.
I'd like to thank the negative reply for that fine speech, and I'd like to welcome up Reply to conclude Affirmative's case and the debate as a whole. Here, here.
I should tie myself out. That would be responsible.
Just had a yarn.
Let's start by looking at resolution processes. The first thing I want to point out at the head of this reply is that most of the appeal processes this negative team wants to talk about, we've already shown you in our model, would still be included under our side for the most serious of violations by our governmental body. Much in the same way that HR departments are accountable under side negative, our body would equivalently be accountable under our side of the house. So I think that immediately takes out a lot of the strongest pushes from side negative when they explain about the worst case scenarios, because the processes in which those would occur would be symmetric under our side of the house. What is actually different? They say that HR departments, when managing those sorts of issues, need nuance and flexibility, but we've provided to you a set of reasons to explain why that often is something which could be actively bad. Firstly, Jack explains to you that understanding or presuming to understand the context behind a situation can often lead to bad decision making because there's an implicit idea that you know what's going on, even where there might be more nuanced details that need to be officially discovered. But we also explain to you down the bench that there are strong norms of where conflicts of interest are likely to occur. This team this team doesn't bother with this idea. They say it doesn't happen. Sophie says that conflicts do not happen. You don't care about your conflicts between underlings and underlings. But I would observe that most people in workplace probably see that conflict as happening between a friend and a friend. That's a situation where you do have a strong pre-existing relationship to each of those individuals you see day to day. But this team says, well, what are the odds that you end up in a relationship of conflict with one of your friends or one of your enemies? But we'll point out that most people obviously have multiple friends and multiple enemies. And the cumulative network effects, where there are a vast number of relationships, each of which could precipitate conflict. That's the point at which those sorts of relationships can become incredibly complex. That's the point at which those sorts of conflicts are incredibly difficult to process. That obviously changes under our side for all the reasons we provide to you. That's really important because we explain to you down the bench when you lack faith that your HR department can be objective, that's the point at which you don't seek out the help at all. This team says that HR departments have incentives to keep their workers happy, to maintain positive and strong cultures. But that's why we provide the clarification that HR departments obviously have a variety of functions, many of which include explicitly the provision of culture and the provision of the workspace, and making it so that the vast majority of individuals who probably do not, for instance, lodge a formal complaint, they are happy. And in such a context, we explain to you that the incentive of companies is to keep HR conflicts as fast as possible, to avoid the potential of it staying unresolved, to avoid the potential of it being leaked and publicized, which means that the incentive of HR, as we explained, is to take incredibly punitive and harsh and often unfair action in ways which are incredibly harmful to workers, but in ways which do not affect the culture and feel of the space, maintaining productivity. That's why we think those corporate incentives are so bad, as we've emphasized down the bench to very little response. This team's major issue with our case then is on efficiency. Right from the outset, the clarification I made at the start of this reply should make you very skeptical about the true cost of our model, because we tell you that for the worst cases and the layers of bureaucracy that this team complains about, they would largely be symmetric under either side of the house. But even if they weren't, we explain to you the ways in which that bureaucratic system is actually very efficient. We explain to you for Felix that oftentimes this looks like things, for example, like automatic filtering of different cases to allocate them to the best agent, or engaging in group trainings that would be difficult to provide to every single individual HR firm to collectively upskill the quality of your HR agent. They complain about taxpayers' money, but Jack already explains that under the status quo, those conflict resolution systems are already provided as a cost on businesses passed through to the workers by their wages anyways. At the end of this debate then, you should weigh the material about conflict the most severely, because the function of HR department, no matter which model it is, does not matter if people do not visit.
I'd like to thank all speakers for that fine debate. I would now like to welcome you to cross the floor, shake hands, and promptly leave the room so we can start our hopefully less than 10-minute deliberation. I'd like to thank everyone for what we agreed was a very high-quality debate. I'll do two things in this way. First, I'll announce the decision, then secondly, I'll explain how we came to the decision as a panel. I'll integrate general feedback into that explanation because I think that's the best way to explain where things come up. So we saw this as a unanimous close win to the negative team. There were 2.5 issues in this debate. The first half issue was just clarification around what did we view with the model and the dispute that happened throughout there and how we viewed that. But then there are two substantive questions. Firstly, on what happens with the dispute resolution process, which side can more effectively resolve disputes and which can do it to more efficient and to a fairer degree. But secondly, on the cost of this model and how that will affect things. So on the first half question about the kind of what is happening with this topic and model, Affirmative claimed that this is likely to happen around formal complaints. I view this as a fair setup in the sense of they have some sense of definitional fiat, and that is generally how this dispute works. But I don't think it affected the debate in any way. And I think the only way that it could affect the debate is if there was just a greater acceptance of this is how it occurs and then running into that. Because I think the most effective rebuttal that came from throughout the negative bench was agreeing on that conception and dealing with that, because it allows them to explain why they get the largest wins there in that debate. But that just explains the context and how we viewed this material and how that led, how we weighed that all. So on the first question, first issue of the debate about which side could solve disputes better, both on a degree of what, and I think there are two kind of sub questions that come to this. Firstly, what are the incentives of either actor? And then secondly, how effectively do they make decisions? Noting that both teams need to prove both of these to prove that they that they can get they can get better decisions. Affirmative claim that HR are likely to make bad decisions, which governments currently will avoid. They have three main claims to this. The first claim is that the HR will benefit the company, given that they're on the company's payroll and that they then want to do decisions which help the profit there. They explain then that governments don't have this incentive, instead they want to help the people. Secondly, and I think that's at first value, and as it comes out at first Affirmative, that's a believable enough response. The degree at which and how they would benefit the company and concretization there could have been helpful because it explains in which decisions and nuance where they benefit the company. Secondly, Affirmative explained that there will be a conflict of interest because HR people might see each other, might see the workers in the workplace and engage with them. So it makes it significantly harder to resolve these disputes where governments are just significantly disconnected and aren't involved in these processes. Finally, Affirmative explained that HR's departments will be small, either because small businesses just care about growth and don't fall into these legal requirements, or things like close-knit communities because they're family businesses, or with large companies, it's hard to justify because it's very expensive. What then saying in comparative that the government has the funding and the funding to solve these problems and to like create good dispute resolution processes, but also are able to concentrate the processes in a set of highly skilled individuals who are specialized to industry and other set like that. How then do I believe all these the mechanization work seems intuitive and is bought at face value at the beginning of this debate. How then do negative respond to this? Negative take a couple of ways of response. The first explanation is to say, in contrast, that HR is actually quite good. At first, negative, we explain that HR has incentives which to firstly attract talent, but secondly, want to also make the workforce happy. Because the company does care about money, and these things where they poorly held dispute resolution processes do impact the individuals. Explains then that HR, at least, and then the context which we then get from second negative, to explain that these are situations which probably then deal with the person-to-person individuals. So in the between disputes within the workplace, HR could make sufficiently good decisions and could have incentives to make good decisions here, because those are things that are likely to help the company. In terms of then where negative try push back, well, their claims are, and where they try to have the biggest win is, well, when it's about the company itself, and when there is a complaint about the company, this is where the conflict of interest mechanism gets activated the largest. However, negative have response in setup, which is then whipped down the bench, to explain that instead there are sufficient ports of call where you go to before you go to HR. So there's things like where you'd talk to unions before you would resolve these disputes and figure out what process you go to. And you can go to things like unions recommend government arbitrators, which do exist in the status quo, being able to avoid this conflict of interest mechanism at the end of the day, and because then they get pushed to the right arbitrator. So it suggests under the first question around incentive that HR does have sufficient incentives to resolve disputes where they are most likely to be used in the status quo. That is person to person, they can do that sufficiently well. And when it comes to like internal business questions about like potentially worker mispay, that aren't things that are solved by HR, but are rather passed on to the arbitrators that are defended by side negative. So just the question of incentive was one that negative could explain is sufficiently fine, noting that's not sufficient for negative to win this, given that they need to explain that where these are likely to be better. And that's where the second line of attack from negative comes, because they explain that instead governments are likely to do this more effectively, and HR will do this governments do this poorly, while HR can do this comparatively better. They explain in how governments will handle this poorly is firstly at first negative that these people will lack information. Governments lack information, so it's likely these decisions are likely to be made early where they don't have enough decision, or they take a long time to make the decision because they have to find the facts. It suggests that you get a comparatively worse decision, which is then explained in comparative down the bench that where HR is just imbued in the workplace, it is significantly easier for them to find this and have this information collected to significantly faster degrees. These decisions can be fast-tracked. Noting that there is the explanation by both teams agreed that faster decisions are important to helping people's like workplace, like to resolving these conflicts, making people's quality of life better. Secondly, negative explained that governments aren't going to be as effective as they need to audit everyone. Affirmative then respond by explaining, well, these individuals will take to this government body a fact-finding process. However, I think this that it doesn't respond to the core idea of negative's argumentation, which they explain that instead in comparative, HR is just significantly better integrated. These processes are significantly faster, and that these are things that you can do, like it's because you'd have to go to this body, have to get this all set up, while HR can probably do it, can do it within significantly greater degrees. They're able to find these facts significantly faster or have these facts in the first place. Then finally, a negative explained that, because the governments are further disconnected from these individuals, they are likely to be a whole lot less organic than HR. So people don't feel as engaged in these decisions, or especially explaining in circumstances where where HR makes a decision which disagrees with one person. They explain that people are more likely to respect this decision, which I think was an interesting and important piece of impact, because it captures a second stakeholder which affirmative don't touch, because it explains why even where people lose out, which will be approximately 50% of the time, they are still more likely to accept this, and that suggests that's going to be on net. Affirmative respond by explaining Firstly, people might want the letter of the law to be followed. This then comes down to a second and extra piece of general feedback where there's a lot of competing claims between what people want and the incentives of both companies and individuals, but it's never weighed out which is the most important incentive, which is the most likely incentive that an individual is able to follow through. So it's very hard for us to a panel to understand how people would like which group would be larger, how people would be more likely to follow one incentive over the other, and why, and that could help boost margins from either side. And then they secondly explain at third affirmative that HI might presume to know the information and hence make a bad decision. However, they don't explain the likelihood of this occurrence, which is instead comes with the explanation that we get from side negative, where this seems like a very unlikely circumstance, given that HR does want to make the good decisions, which they explain. We finally then get a bunch of direct responses from second negative to all the claims about why HR is bad, where they firstly explain on what HR wants to benefit the company. The company also have a bunch of other incentives, where things like there might be worker migration between other low-skilled workforces, there might be class action lawsuits, or there might be closely watched by watchdogs, because in these circumstances, to explain that even in situations where HR might be bad, this is already at least partially accounted for, mitigating this incentive, explaining that these aren't a large set of companies. Secondly, on explaining the conflict of interest, they explain that often the framing where it's oftentimes not in the circumstances where it conflicts with those who pay them, or in the point where CEOs also understand where their reputation can be hurt in the very worst circumstances as well. So HR probably, even when it comes to company, action against the company, HR at least have some positive incentives to look after the workers' rights there, things like dynamics. And they're also people who are likely to understand workplace dynamics sufficiently better, so can probably better navigate the situations. And finally, on explaining HR are small, they just explain in counter model that perhaps they can just legalize having greater degrees of HR funding and all that kind of stuff. So at the end of the day, what do we believe as a panel? We believe that company HR had sufficient incentives to solve low-level disputes, and that those incentives were positive. They would solve them in good ways, but also they would solve these disputes in significantly better ways than government, because they could better integrate themselves, they could better collect this information, and they could better explain and solve these disputes. And people who got the loss of dispute would be more willing to accept that. This was the most likely circumstance in the debate, and this was the largest set of circumstances, given that the set of circumstances which Affirmative wanted to defend where there's a complete disregard for legal process are just incredibly few and far between. But even in the and so it meant that in terms of weighing, even if negative or affirmative were able to claim this circumstance, negative outweigh on the vast majority of circumstances where we care about HR, where it's the most effective and it's likely to have the most impact. But they even are able to sufficiently mitigate that circumstance to explain that, well, these situations are already handled by these regulated bodies and people are passed on there, as explained earlier. So it explains that on dispute resolution, negative are able to win on this, but the degree at which they win is in terms of explaining the scale of which the change between these two could be greater done. So it's not a especially large win in terms of impact, but it is sufficient enough to win them on the debate, because that's where most of the debate occurs. Second question then on cost. I just want to explain the framing of why I didn't view we didn't view cost as an especially important issue in the debate. The first reason why is that I don't think negative actually set a set counterfactual which they want to defend. They suggest that they might defend a couple of options, but it's hard to understand which impact they specifically want in the debate. So it's very hard to value that impact in that debate, why that was something that was going to be debate winning. The second problem is that negative team don't explain or establish why these things are large problems that need to be solved in the status quo, and why this money is likely to be the thing that solves them. So a greater degree of setting up and establishing the problem could have helped make this debate winning. But I do think negative sufficiently explain why this will be costly, because I explained the arbitration process is going to be costly with all the fact finding. But there are also things like lack of cost control and bailing out. And they explain that there are likely to be some harms that will probably impact people like workers, and that this money can be done in sufficient ways. And I don't think affirmative ever provide. I'm not sufficient enough pushback on this. And so while negative are able to win this, it isn't the most important thing in the debate, and just needs some extra bit of work to make it an extra debate winning front. That explains how we viewed the debate. If we missed anything, because this was a very dense debate, happy to discuss in terms of it's not because I missed it, but it's because that's what we valued as the most important contributions, yada yada, and happy to discuss that all. Otherwise, good luck with the